Now when I'm out and about and visiting Civil War sites, there's a lot of different places that you can go throughout Virginia to visit. But one of my all-time favorite places to go to is Petersburg National Battlefield. And the primary reason for that is the different types of earthworks that they have out here and the massive story of the men that fought out here. There's so many different stories to tell at this location. So much loss, death, and destruction that happened out here over the course of those 9, almost 10 months. This is one of the best places to go to. So Battery 5 is sitting directly behind me here. Now this location is significant because the fight that happened here for that second battle of Petersburg just before the siege took place. This location, you can see directly behind me just how steep the earthworks still are, right over my shoulder there. Soldiers would have had to have climbed up over these earthworks into the danger behind me where the cannons were placed and the Confederate soldiers, and fight their way through this and take this position. And that's exactly what they did that first day of that second battle of Petersburg, just before they started to lay siege to Petersburg, Virginia. Now when you're out here on this battlefield, you get to see lots of different scenery, lots of different nature trails out here for you to take. And then there's brooks that run through the trails, but beware when you're out on this trail. A lot of these brooks, the water comes from the streets out here in Petersburg, and that water is very polluted. Probably wouldn't want to dip your feet in it, but there's a lot of beautiful scenery out here, and no doubt the soldiers, as they were coming up through here, for example, Battery 5 is directly ahead of me, but as those soldiers were coming from behind me in this direction headed towards here, they would have crossed the path of waterways like this, and this would have been a purposeful barrier that the Confederate soldiers would have made sure it was in place, because they wanted to slow down the Union troops as they were coming along this entire time. This is the reason why certain batteries are placed where they're placed. Now, just off the trail here at Petersburg, there's a nice display of what a powder magazine would have looked like in an earthen fort. Obviously the sign's up to let you know, but if you've never seen one before, this is how they build it up. They place the logs to create the structure, and then they mound the dirt on top, and then of course there's usually a door in place for you to go in and out of. But the reason why powder magazines are put in place in the first place is because you want to store the powder in a secure location in the event that there is a fire or some sort of a explosion or intrusion by a cannonball or something like that. If that powder magazine goes off, then it could blow up the entire battery. So they place it in a position which is usually less detrimental to the actual battery or fort. Now, if you've ever wanted to get out and touch a piece of history, you can do that here at Petersburg. There are forts and locations that you can go to, which is, you know, earthen forts. That's in a lot of Civil War battlefields. But here at Petersburg, they have a very famous artillery piece called the Dictator. And that's this massive piece right here behind me. The Dictator has been famously photographed in Civil War photographs on a rail cart in the 1860s. And you can see this on that rail cart. It's massive size. And here in Petersburg, it's on display and you can actually touch it. So another big point of interest out here in Petersburg for the driving tour is Fort Friend, or Battery 8, which is directly behind me here. Now, the reason why this place became significant is because during that first and second assault that came through here, or the second assault, by the 16th, the first 11 batteries ended up in the hands of the Federals. Well, this place here had the 1st and 22nd U.S. colored troops fighting in this location to take these works directly behind me. That was a very significant moment in history at that time, and the men fought hard at this location. And Weiss's Virginians did not just give it up. They fought as hard as they could to keep this location, but those soldiers were victorious. And then secondly, another attack happened at Fort Stedman. Now Fort Stedman, that was Lee's last real offensive here in Petersburg, and cannons from this location that had been captured, and this location had been captured, the cannons fired towards Fort Stedman to help prevent the all-out failure at that location. And had it not been for the Federals basically taking spots like this behind me here, there may have been a situation where Lee could have actually broke through and it would have succeeded. But thanks to the Federals' fight here that happened during that second battle of Petersburg, that was unsuccessful, and the siege continued until Robert E. Lee was forced out of his works and on to Appomattox. One of the other great reasons to visit Petersburg National Battlefield are displays like the one behind me here. Now, if you've seen a lot of the late war photographs, 1864, 1865, you'll see log cabins kind of like what's behind me here during winter quarters. And during the battle out here, it was no different than any other location during winter quarters. They tried to build up something suitable for themselves to go into quarters in, but the difference here is we're talking about a siege. So these cabins kind of became a permanent home, especially for Grant out at City Point. And you can come out here and walk inside the displays that are out here. And I'm going to pan around behind me here. You can also see what it would have looked like if you were behind defensive works during that time. They've built up some defensive works out here, and they have placed up abatis around it and all kinds of stuff for you to see. So it's pretty neat perspective coming from here, to look over the earthworks, the defensive works, down towards where the enemy would have been coming from. And if you go out front and walk towards those earthworks, it's kind of a daunting thing to stare at, knowing that if you're running towards this location, it's kind of a tough spot for you to be in. So when the Confederates were attacking Fort Stedman, they were attacking a location that looked a lot like this, with the defensive works and the abatis that were sitting out front. These pointy, sharp, barbed pieces of wood would surely catch you when you fall, whenever you're running towards the fort and you get shot. But that fall is not going to be nice. We'll take a walk around this location so you can see what it looks like. Imagine, if you will, it's 1864 and you're inside of a battery or fort, and your only sense of protection just happens to be a location like this behind me here. Imagine you're the enemy on the outside coming towards it. Do you really want to attempt that? Well, the worst part is you're not even going at it as an individual. You're going at it as a unit. You're fighting at this location in long columns and long lines, straight up, going towards the location with the cannons placed over top and the soldiers placed in there. And if you take this strong point, you are told to turn the cannons on the enemy and then sweep from the left and the right down the ranks of the soldiers that are behind their defense works. And that is exactly what happened, or was attempting to be completed at Fort Stedman. But instead they get to this strong point and they fight from that location, and then it just kind of crumbles and falls apart from there. Now this stop that I'm at right now in Petersburg is Fort Stedman. And at this location there would have been 6 cannons and about 300 men garrisoned here. We're during that fateful fight when Lee finally decided to make an offensive happen. This was the central point of that attack for Gordon. And at this location, the Confederates did take control of it for a short period of time. But off in the distance in front of me there's another spot, another garrison or battery that ends up stopping the fight that happens here and stopping the Confederates from sweeping the Union lines left and right. March 25th of 1865 was one heck of a day for the Confederates. They decided to go on an offensive to attack. Lee had made a plan with Gordon, and it included sending men forward to chop down abatis, to go through skirmisher lines, to sneak up on the opponent, and to kill them as they're sleeping in their trenches. And then, if they made it that far, send in massive waves of men over Fort Stedman and assault it by storm and take it. Once that attack happens, sweep down the lines, both left and right hand side, and take the other positions that are next to Fort Stedman and turn the guns on the United States Army. It would have worked. had there not been some quick thinking officers out here in these fields at Petersburg. And that's where we're at today. Fort Stedman, Petersburg, Virginia. Now across these fields directly in front of me here would be the same cornfield that was once here back in June of 1864 when this all started. And directly out there towards my left-hand side is where the 1st Maine came across to attack. Now if you watched one of my previous videos, I talked about how the 1st Maine came across here and ended up leaving 632 of their men behind on this open field. Well, when March of 1865 rolls around, it's the Confederates' turn. The Confederates are stuck in a fort directly behind me over here, and their earthworks are stretching out down along this direction. They need to get out from behind these earthworks. They are starving to death. They do not know how they're going to protect the last remaining railroad, and Lee knows that he's got to get his men out in the open so that he can feed them and that he can take care of his army and get them strengthened for another offensive. But he can't do that from behind these earthworks. So he's got to break the Federals in his front, recapture some of these lines that used to be in the hands of the Confederates, and then push them out into the open so that he can have a battle in the open, a large fight. They come up with a plan, and they decide to stretch across this field in front of me here towards Fort Stedman, which is a stronghold that the Union has directly off to my front. Now standing here on this field, you can see it sticking up in the air. It's a large earthen mound even today. Some 159 years later, the dirt still sticks up pretty high. And then if you look off in this direction over here, there's another fort, another strong point for the Union soldiers to stay behind. So if you're a Confederate soldier and you're lining up behind me and you're getting ready to fight and the skirmishers are out front, and in the middle of the night you can hear the stepping and the stomping of feet coming across the grass, very light at first, but then all of a sudden you hear the muffled sounds of people being attacked, and you can hear axes chopping in the middle of the night. Imagine how your heart's racing as you're standing in line waiting to attack Fort Stedman, not knowing if this is going to be a victorious moment for you or if it's going to be a massive failure. But one thing's for sure, you've got to get through the line. You have to force your way out. If you don't, there is no saving yourself back here behind these earthen mounds. So directly behind me here is Colquitt's Salient. This is the same location that the Confederate soldiers defended from the 1st Maine and ended up tearing them apart right out here in the fields in front of me. And from this same salient, John B. Gordon has hand-selected a number of men and units to go into the fight and attack that long open field in front of me going towards Fort Stedman. Now this is going to be an uphill battle, and I'm not just talking about the terrain. The line itself is heavily guarded. There are picket lines all out front, sharpshooters are posted. There's about 3 to 5 guns that are up in Fort Stedman. There's another battery off in the location directly off to the right hand side if you're facing it, where there are more guns placed and aimed towards this salient here behind me. So if you're a soldier stepping off over here and you're headed in that direction, there's nothing safe about it. Besides the fact that it is combat, and there's never really anything safe about going into combat. Now to show you that open ground we were talking about here when we talked about the soldiers having to go across, out of that direction there where the little mounds of dirt are, that is Fort Stedman. This open field here is what you have to charge across from Colquitt Salient. Now in June of 1864, the 1st Maine came from over in that direction and up towards this area here trying to take this location, and ended up leaving the majority of their men out here on these fields. Now directly off in front of me there, the fight takes place in earnest early in the morning, trying to catch the Union Army off guard. And it stretches out all the way to this direction over here. There's another battery in that location there where the Confederate soldiers also plan on attacking and spreading out in that direction. But the quick thinking officers over there stopped the fight and actually turn their guns attention to Fort Stedman and end up blasting Confederates as they are trying to retreat across this field back towards Colquitt Salient. And that's pretty much the end of it for them here. Once they realize that they cannot do an offensive and break out, then it's basically the sit back and wait game. And eventually the Union Army breaks through and the Confederates have to leave their trenches behind and end up on the road to Appomattox towards surrender. So all along this line that I'm walking right now, there would have been small pits. Men would have been hunkered down inside those pits, and they were the advance warning for the main army back in Fort Stedman and the rest of the earthworks out front. Well, early in the morning, the Confederates gear up and get ready to go. And they bring their axes with them, and they bring their guns, and they bring knives, and they bring anything that they can get their hands on to help them with the fight. They come across this field, and as they venture out here, they're entering open ground, the dead zone right in between. And they find pickets of soldiers all throughout. And one by one small picket at a time, they hit those lines and they attack the soldiers inside those pits. Some of them get off shots. Those shots become a warning shot, and it allows the army back in the fort here to know something's happening. Well, it was kind of obvious there for a little while anyhow. A large body of men in the Civil War moving across a field is pretty loud. And the men back here in the fort can hear it. And they know the attack's about to come in earnest. The main point of those early men coming out here is to get inside and to try to chop their way through some of the protection that's in place so that the main lines can actually get in. Now it's a windy day out here in Petersburg, Virginia. We just had some storms in the area not too long ago. So it's cold and it's windy and it's wet. But I'm laid out on the ground here inside of Fort Haskell to try to lower the wind into my microphone. But Fort Haskell is important because this is the location that the survivors from Fort Stedman would have fled to. They come running up the banks here and end up inside this fort, and then they turn their guns and start fighting towards the Confederates that are coming from Fort Stedman and firing down in towards Fort Stedman. The Confederates only had Fort Stedman for about 10 to 15 minutes before the Union soldiers had retaken that fort. But for a moment, it looked pretty hairy over there. I like to come to this fort and take a look out over the field and just kind of realize the fight that happened right across that field there behind me. The desperate attempt that the Confederates made at trying to break through these lines here so that they could resupply and reorganize and move on and try to push the Union soldiers out from their front. It was the last major offensive that Lee took. But the one main reason why I like coming over here is I like talking about Bob Carson. Now, Bob Carson is a soldier that the night before the fight happened, his brother is picked to go into the fight. Bob's worried that his brother is going to be killed in this fight. So he wants to go into the fight with him, and he wants to protect his brother. And if his brother dies, he wants to take the body back so he can send it back home to his family. I believe it's in Georgia. Well, Bob goes into the fight with his brother in those fields right behind me there. His brother doesn't die. Bob Carson dies. His brother comes out of Fort Stedman with canister and all kinds of fire and shot happening behind him. And as he's in that location, running out of that fort, he can see his brother's lifeless body on the ground. And with the help of friends, he grabs his brother and he takes his brother back to Colquitt Salient so that it can be sent back home to be buried. That's just one of the main stories, or one of the minor stories that happens out here for the main story of the Battle of Fort Stedman. Fort Haskell and Fort Stedman are two of the major stops here at Petersburg National Park that you can go to and visit and stand on the ground where these fights happen, where the struggles took place. But it's personal stories like that about soldiers that fought here. That's what really makes the difference. It brings it home and it makes you kind of understand where they're coming from. These soldiers out here, no matter what side they're fighting on, they have brothers that are fighting in ranks with them, and some of them have brothers fighting against them. It's a deadly game that they're playing, and in the end, they all seem to lose something. Well, that was great. Now we're going to push off towards the location where the Battle of the Crater took place here in Petersburg. Another great stop to go to out here at Petersburg is here at the Taylor homestead, or the farm, just across the way from the crater. The crater you can see right there over my shoulder. This is where the Battle of the Crater took place, and there is a sweeping view that goes down through the valley here, across where the railroad tracks are, and straight off to the crater. Now, this farm that was out here was owned by a man named William Byrd Taylor. Now, William Taylor, he ended up purchasing this area from his mother, and he kept slaves here on the property, and the location where you see the big chimney at here at the farmstead is actually the kitchen and roughly the area where the slaves would have been kept out here on this farmstead. Now, across the way in the distance, on the opposite side of where the crater is, Fort Mortar would have been located. William Taylor ends up farming this land here until the battle or the siege takes place. Then he leaves this location, and almost immediately after he leaves, his house burns down, and the properties out here burn down with the battle raging around it. It displaces the people that stay here, including Mr. Taylor and his family too. When he gets back to the property, however, Mr. Taylor decides he's going to rebuild. But he has a lot less money than he had before, and a lot less property. He's built a small home here on top of where the actual kitchen used to be, and the value of this location after the war's over with is now valued at about 4% of what it used to be valued prior to the war. So you can see kind of the difference in the dynamic for Mr. Bird here, or Mr. William Bird Taylor, at this location in Petersburg. Now the structure still has the chimney standing upright, and there's a large place where you can go to and just kind of sit underneath a tree if you want to, view the field all the way around, all the way down to the crater. I love coming out to this location to think about the history that took place out here at Petersburg. Now, one of the final stops out here at Petersburg that I like to go to, and it coincidentally is the final stop here at this portion of the battlefield, is the crater, where the Battle of the Crater took place out here in July of 1864. Now, just shortly, maybe a little over a month after the first initial battles that took place out here for Petersburg, the siege is set in, and the men went to work almost immediately on building a mine shaft out here. They filled that mine shaft with gunpowder, and they blew it to smithereens out here in July. The plan did not work out, not like they hoped it would. Now, the 48th Pennsylvania went out here and got ready and set to start digging this mine. And they'd gotten approval. And a battle plan had been set up by Burnside. Everything was in order. They were going to be sending in the U.S. colored troops first. That mine shaft right there, which was a little bit further out, but that mine shaft is where they were digging and going back towards where the Confederate trenches and earthworks are. The battle plan was simple. Dig that hole, pack it full of gunpowder, and when they blow it to smithereens, send in the U.S. colored troops first. And then they were going to attack and spread left, spread right, bust the line wide open where the Confederates are, and seize the victory. But a change happened late in the game. The units that were prepared to go into the fight out here did not get allowed to do what it is that they were supposed to do. They decided to make a shift in who was going in first, simply because of politics. They didn't want the optics of sending in the African American troops first, because they would be considered sent in for slaughter. They were afraid people were going to see that as a sign of weakness, I guess. So they make the change, and then troops that were not prepared to go into the fight here, who were also tired and weakened from the previous week's fighting, go in here half-cocked and not ready to go. What results is a large hole in the ground and a bunch of troops stuck down inside. African Americans are stuck inside this hole. Confederates are standing on top, and they are pouring lead into them as quickly as they can get up here. And it's a bloodbath, and just very, very tragic what happens out here at the Battle of the Crater. Now, the National Park does a really good job at explaining this crater and how the shaft was built. In order to get fresh oxygen into this shaft, you have to build a tunnel up. It's kind of a ventilation shaft. The exit's right there in front of me. That's the ventilation shaft. And so you light a fire at that ventilation shaft, and that fire pulls all the bad air out of the shaft and circulates air into this this deadly shaft heading towards the Confederate earthworks. And the reason for that is to ventilate the air on the inside and bring in fresh oxygen so that you can breathe better, and it controls the air on the inside. Now, when we get up here and take a look at what's left of this crater, it's not going to look that large. And when you come out here to visit this place yourself, the first thought that you have is that it? Because the pictures from history show a much larger hole in the ground. And through erosion and time, that's the truth. The crater has kind of shrunken in size a little bit. But it is still neat to see it sitting right alongside the Confederate earthworks. And the tunnel, you can see the depression in the ground as it's heading towards where the crater was. This was not a very good situation here. For the troops defending this location, you're sitting on top of Earth 1 minute. The next minute, the Earth explodes around you, and if you're lucky enough to make it out alive, you're buried under dirt. The majority of them were actually blown into pieces. For the soldiers going into the pit, it's a muddy mess. You get down in there to fight, thinking that you're going to be able to get out on the other side. There's no way to come back up, and you're stuck inside this crater as the Confederate soldiers on the outside are happily obliging you with death as they're firing down in on top of you. Well, that's some of my favorite locations out here, Petersburg, at the National Park. I hope you enjoyed the video. Just so happens that tomorrow is the 159th anniversary of the Battle of Fort Stedman. So I encourage you to go back and watch that video I did about Fort Stedman just last year. Also, coming up this year at Petersburg should be the 160th anniversary of the Battle of the Crater. I have a video about that as well, but this year we're going to come back and we're going to shoot another video, this time a little bit more in depth, in detail about the battle that took place out here. So that's all from Petersburg. Until next time, History with Waffles.